Great, thank you so much, Alex. Okay, with that said, we'll go ahead and get started. So again, welcome to today's Lunch and Learn on groundwater management in Yuba County. This is a special treat during Groundwater Awareness Week. It's our first virtual Lunch and Learn. And without further ado, I'll pass it over to Joanna Lessard with the Yuba Water Agency to get us started.
Thanks, Bonnie. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. For those of you who maybe joined before the introductions, I'll just say again, I'm Joanna Lessard and I'm a project manager with the Yuba Water Agency, and I'm really excited to be here today to sort of kick off this first Lunch and Learn and tell you a little bit more about our groundwater management program. So this slide shows the agenda of what we're hoping to cover today. That video was a great introduction, but we're going to dive in a little deeper here and give you a bit more background on groundwater and our groundwater management. Next slide. So the Yuba Water Agency was created in 1959. We're a standalone public agency with a mission to sustainably manage our water resources for flood risk reduction and reliable water supply. Part of that mission is specifically to optimize the management and delivery of surface water and groundwater supplies for all beneficial uses. And what that term beneficial uses mean are things like domestic water supplies for drinking water and watering gardens, agricultural water supplies for animals and crops, municipal water supplies, so that's water for cities, also for drinking water, and then environmental uses for things like stream flows. Next slide. Yuba Water Agency has been sustainably managing groundwater in the region for decades. We have a long database that we'll go over later on to talk more about that. But in 2014, California passed what's called the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. It's also referred to as SGMA. And that created the regulatory framework for sustainable management of the state's groundwater resources. Now, SGMA empowers local agencies to form what's called groundwater sustainability agencies, and these are new agencies that are tasked with managing groundwater basins sustainably, and it requires those GSAs to create and adopt groundwater sustainability plans that really govern how those basins will manage groundwater now and into the future. Yuba Water became a groundwater sustainability agency in 2015 and expanded our responsibility for ensuring our groundwater resources are sustainably managed in the long term. Next slide.
Okay, so I'll take up on what is groundwater. Thank you, Joanna, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jim Blanke, a senior hydrogeologist with Woodard and Curran. Been working with Yuba Water Agency since about 2015 and working with the agency on a variety of their innovative groundwater management activities. Next slide. So we'll start off with some basics about what is groundwater. We have a little diagram here that shows a cross section through the earth into the depths of the earth there. And groundwater is basically the water beneath the surface of the earth in which the soil is completely saturated with water. So what happens in our diagram here, we have our little rain cloud, we have the precipitation, the rainfall that comes down, it lands on the ground surface, or some of that land may be irrigated by surface water or groundwater. The plants use some of that water evaporates away. The remainder of that water seeps down into the subsurface through gravity. And as it seeps through the subsurface, it forms a pool of water in the earth. And so that's a body of water that's in between the grains of clay, sand, silt, and gravel in the subsurface. We call that an alluvial aquifer, and there's no test here, but that term is just important to contrast with a fractured rock aquifer that we do have in some parts of the county and the more mountainous portions of the eastern parts of the county. But a couple of key things to remember here is that groundwater is not an underground river. When we're talking about groundwater management in the valley portion of Yuba County, we are talking about this alluvial aquifer where there is water in between these little grains of sand and silt and gravel, and there's not a large channel or large underground river in which we're accessing. Next slide. So what about the foothills? I mentioned alluvial aquifer. I mentioned that the eastern portions of the county, can be up to a mile in elevation, and it's rock there. It's not individual grains of sand, silt, and clay. So just briefly to touch on the foothills and what it means in case we have some members of the public here from the foothills area. Sigma is limited by law to the alluvial aquifer. So it says, here are the groundwater basins, these are our alluvial basins, and these are the areas that we're going to try and manage. And it does that for a variety of reasons, and largely because the science behind fractured rock aquifers is that they are highly variable and generally lower yielding. We don't have the large volumes of water being used from those aquifer systems, and they're poorly and erratically connected. So it's really very localized issues and hard to manage on a regional basis. So this diagram here shows us some information about a generalized area. You can see kind of where the pointer is there. Our alluvial aquifer, and there's a little blow up there of the individual little grains of sand and silt and clay, and little blue bits in between those grains of sand, silt, and clay, and that's our groundwater and the water in the aquifer system. If you look off to the left or off to the right, you can see we get up into the foothills and mountain areas, and it's all fractured rock there. So there's still water within those fractures. Of course, the rocks themselves hold very little water and no water that you can really access. But within those fractures, there is water. And in the foothills, you can put in a well and access that water. And you can't have issues if a neighbor accesses the same fracture you do. So it really depends on where those fractures are, how big they are, and where they go. Next slide. So while we're not talking a lot about fractured rock today, and we'll continue to talk more about our alluvial basins throughout the rest of the presentation, I did want to give a couple of resources for people that are interested in fractured rock issues up in the foothills. So if you do have an issue with your well, if you have a dry well or concerns about it, you may want to reach out to Yuba County, specifically the Office of Emergency Services. It has some programs around dry wells. That's accessible at the website here, yuba.org. Another opportunity is to reach out to the California Department of Water Resources, also known as DWR, who operates a dry well reporting system, and the web address is there, mydrywatersupply.water.ca.gov. That's more of a reporting system, more so than a response system, but it's good if you do have issues to start documenting those, because the more that those issues can be documented, the better the response can be. Next slide. So back to our alluvial aquifer system and back to our little cross section here. So I talked a lot about the precipitation coming down. We have some little trees there, which could be a tree in your front yard that you water. It could be a grove of almond trees that get irrigated. We have a little rice field there. So these are all areas where water is being applied to the surface. And like I said, some of that water seeps down into the subsurface, and that's recharge. And so when we talk about managing the water system and managing the groundwater system, we look at our inflows to the system and our outflows to the system, and that's what we term our recharge and discharge. So recharge is water entering the system, and that can be via rain and snow, seepage from rivers and streams, flow beneath the surface, all of those things. So that's where water gets into the aquifer system. And then where does water leave the system? It's largely through pumping of groundwater for the uses that Joanna talked about in her beneficial use discussion earlier. And it can also be used directly by plants, especially where the groundwater levels are very shallow and plants may be directly accessing that groundwater. And it can also be discharged to rivers and streams, adding more water into those rivers and streams. So when we look to manage the groundwater system, we look at what the differences are between recharge and discharge and understand how that volume is changing over time. We also try to understand how we can manage those different components in order to make sure we have a sustainable groundwater system. Next slide, please. Okay, so we talked about inflows and outflows. We talked about the recharge and discharge and how it's important to try to balance them. So groundwater levels fluctuate in response to natural hydrology and human activities. So if we have more pumping, if we have less recharge, you'll see that the groundwater levels will decline like it did in our little animation there. So that is when we have more outflows than inflows. And so the groundwater storage declines, and then the groundwater levels decline. So the groundwater becomes deeper in the subsurface, more challenging to access by the wells, more challenging to access by the plants that may be using that water directly. Conversely, if we have more recharge, if it's a wet year, or if we start pumping less, or if we start recharging more, groundwater levels will rise. And so we'll have more water in the aquifer system, and groundwater levels will become higher and easier to access for people and for the ecosystems. So again, these are the fluctuations that we manage to support long-term, stable, sustainable water supplies in the Yuba subbasins. Next slide, please. So where are the Yuba groundwater subbasins? We have a map here on the right side of the page that shows the locations of it. It's largely the valley portions of Yuba County. So you'll see that it extends throughout most of the western portions of Yuba County over to the Feather River, down to the Bear and up towards Huncock Creek. It's split into two subbasins here, the North Yuba Subbasin, which is north of the Yuba River, and the South Yuba Subbasin, south of the Yuba River. Those are the designations that are provided by the state of California through their Department of Water Resources that's divided up the state's groundwater subbasins into these different entities. But we manage the two together so that they do function as a unit, and recognizing the importance of having a unified approach to groundwater management across the entire Yuba subbasins. As far as uses within the subbasins, urban and rural domestic users are using entirely groundwater. So whether you have a domestic well, a small domestic well at your house that you use as the sole source of water for your house, or whether you live in Marysville or Wheatland or Linda or Plumas Lake or someplace like that, you're using groundwater for your water supply. Agriculture, on the other hand, uses a mix of surface water and groundwater to meet their needs. We saw a little bit of that in the video, and we'll go into that a little bit more detail in following slides. Next slide, please. To go back a little bit farther and some of the history that we heard from Charlie Matthews Sr. in the video earlier, water use has been important throughout the history of Yuba County, and wells were used in the very earliest settlements, largely for small uses such as domestic uses and watering stock and things like that. There wasn't large scale usage of groundwater until the pumping and drilling techniques improved, and that was in the late 1800s and early 1900s. About the same time in the 1870s, late 1800s, early 1900s, we started to get some of the major surface water diversions to provide surface water for agricultural uses throughout the county. And we'll see a couple of pictures there on the right-hand side. There's one on the top, a peach orchard, and then on the bottom of a rice field there, some of the old-time farming, which is of course dependent on irrigation. You can't grow peaches and rice without irrigation. If you look closely on that rice field, you can see the horses out there working the field. So it's, things have changed a lot, but the need for irrigation is something that hasn't changed. We saw substantial increases in irrigation after the Great Depression and World War II. Technology advanced a lot during that time period, but it wasn't really until after World War II that there was the opportunity to implement some of that technology and really increase the use of water in the subbasins and increase the agricultural productivity of the subbasins by accessing that groundwater. The groundwater use was really focused on the South Yuba subbasin. We heard in the video some declining groundwater levels from approximately the 1940s, again, that post-war time period, through 1980s. And then again, like they mentioned in the video, additional surface water was brought into the South Yuba subbasin to reverse that trend and return the groundwater levels back to their historical levels. So that's really been a success story of water management within the Yuba subbasins. It's really something that's been an impressive change in conditions to really return us back to a good sustainable condition back in the South Yuba subbasin. Meanwhile, the North Yuba subbasin has maintained long-term stable groundwater conditions throughout recorded history, largely because of the investments that were put in a long time ago to supply surface water for the irrigated ag uses in that part of the county. Next slide, please. Conjunctive water use, we talked about conjunctive water use in that video. It's a water management strategy that coordinates groundwater and surface water. So basically it's using more surface water during the wet and normal time periods when there's ample surface water available, and we're taking that surface water isn't going to have the kind of impacts that it would during a dry period. And then during dry periods, use more groundwater and leave that surface water in the river for other beneficial uses. So basically, we're using our groundwater system as a reservoir to maintain supplies during drought. That use of surface water during the wet and normal periods helps recharge our water system, our groundwater system, and make sure that water is available for us during droughts, so that we can increase that groundwater use in the drought period without having impacts. And that really benefits not only the direct users of the water to use it for urban and agricultural uses, but also benefits fish and wildlife and users across the state through some of the sales that were mentioned in the video. Next slide, please. There are, of course, challenges associated with conjunctive use. One is maintaining additional infrastructure. If you want to provide groundwater at some time and surface water at another time, then you have to have facilities to divert and distribute that surface water, and you have to have the facilities in order to pump the groundwater. So there are necessary activities and expenses that are associated with being able to do that, but the effort is really worth it to be able to manage the water properly. Another is protecting surface water supplies, making sure we monitor and keep up to date and respond to state activities that may threaten some of the water supplies that we have, and planning for climate change and keeping an eye on climate change and what that means for the volume of precipitation and snowfall that we might get, and also what it might mean for changes of precipitation from a more snow-based system to a more rain-based system, and how we can adjust to respond to climate change. Another item is making sure we construct new wells at sustainable depths. I mentioned that conjunctive use really helps us use that groundwater basin as a storage aquifer, and it really amplifies groundwater levels due to higher highs. So when we use more surface water, groundwater levels go up, but when those dry periods go down, they're going to go down as well. And so we need to make sure that we build the wells deep enough so they can access water in the long term and aren't built overly shallow just when the groundwater levels are very high. Next slide, please. So a little bit of history of the actual groundwater management in the Yuba subbasins. Groundwater management goes back a long way, but as far as more formalized management with plans and reports and things like that, we can really point to 2005 with the groundwater management plan that was developed then, along with the wave of groundwater management plans that were developed across the state through some additional state legislation that allowed for this kind of groundwater management planning. That groundwater management plan was updated in 2010. And was planned to be updated on about a 5-year increment, except for SGMA came around in 2014 and changed the game considerably, and led to the need to develop a groundwater sustainability plan, which is a little bit different from those groundwater management plans. And we'll get to that in the next slide. But we did put together our groundwater sustainability plan in 2019 and adopted it in 2020. Next slide. So Joanna mentioned a little bit about the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. Again, it was implemented by the state beginning in January 1st, 2015, and provides a framework for sustainable management of groundwater basins. It promotes local management through the development of or formation of local groundwater sustainability agencies. We have 3 groundwater sustainability agencies here within the Yuba subbasins. One, of course, is the Yuba Water Agency. And then we also have some overlapping groundwater sustainability agencies with the city of Marysville and also Corridor Irrigation District. And the SGMA also requires the preparation of groundwater sustainability plans. And we coordinated to have one groundwater sustainability plan formed to cover the entirety of the Yuba subbasins. So by having that one plan, it makes groundwater management much more unified and much easier to track and much more effective. Finally, it sets regulatory requirements for submitting plans, reporting progress, and achieving sustainability. And this is really the game changer that was SGMA, are these regulatory requirements. And what SGMA says is that the locals have to go out, figure out what sustainable management is, figure out how to monitor for it and how to track it and see if it's being met. And if these things don't come to be, then the state of California has the opportunity to step in and manage the basin as they see fit. So it's that regulatory driver that's making sure that all the subbasins within the state that are subject to SGMA are proceeding with meeting those requirements. Next slide, please. So what is sustainability under SGMA? So sustainability is the management and use of groundwater in a manner that can be maintained without causing undesirable results. So SGMA set up 6 categories of items that we had to look at called sustainability indicators. The first is probably the most obvious, which is chronic lowering of groundwater levels. We usually think about groundwater levels when we think about groundwater, and making sure they don't go so low that they start impacting some of the users of groundwater. But there are other ones as well. Significant and unreasonable land subsidence, and that's the sinking of the actual land surface that's caused by extracting too much groundwater from certain types of clays that are subject to this kind of compaction, and kind of the grains of the clay actually smush together and the entire ground surface can go down. We don't experience that here to any degree in the Yuba subbasins, but you do see that in parts of the state farther south. Degradation of groundwater quality, making sure that groundwater quality stays good for all the beneficial uses. groundwater related surface water depletions, so making sure that the conditions in the groundwater system aren't resulting in significant unreasonable impacts to the surface water system by either not recharging that stream enough or by pulling too much water out of that stream as recharge. And then two others that were deemed not relevant indicators for the Yuba subbasins because they don't exist and aren't likely to exist in the subbasin. And that is significant unreasonable reduction of groundwater storage. That one's not relevant here because we have substantial amounts of groundwater in storage. And the real issue with groundwater storage is not the volume in storage, but really being able to reach it and making sure that the groundwater levels are appropriate for the beneficial uses that we have. The other one is a little bit more obvious, that's seawater intrusion. Of course, the Yuba subbasins are a long way from the Pacific Ocean and from the San Francisco Bay Delta, so we don't need to worry about that one here. Next slide. So how do we know we're sustainable? Well, so we looked at all those sustainability indicators through the groundwater sustainability plan. We established what those undesirable results are, and then we started putting together numbers, minimum thresholds, interim milestones for certain monitoring locations that really helps us understand whether or not we're experiencing those undesirable results. And so with those undesirable results established, we go out and we monitor, and Charles is going to talk to you a little bit about the monitoring after I'm finished. But we do that monitoring, we collect the results, and then we compare them against these thresholds. We compare them against the definition of undesirable results to make sure that we're meeting what we consider sustainable conditions here in the Yuba subbasins. Next slide. So now how do I know we're sustainable? And that's not me, that's you, I. And so there's a variety of things that we have for reporting and for accessing data that you can access. The first is annual reports. So SGMA requires annual reports to be released every April, and that every April covers the previous water year. And so it'll cover through fall of 2020, the one that we're planning to release here in the next couple of weeks. Provides information on the status of the basin, so it provides information on groundwater levels and groundwater quality, and compares those items to the minimum thresholds and discusses whether or not we're achieving the sustainability that we desired to achieve in our GSP. It also describes the relevant activities, the projects and management actions that are underway to help us monitor the basin and achieve sustainability over time. The other item that you can do is you can attend the Groundwater Sustainability Committee meetings. So these committee meetings are held on a quarterly basis. Of course, we used to do them in person in Marysville, but now they're all online like everything else. So hopefully we'll get back to in-person meetings at some point. But they're held on a quarterly basis, at least now. And they provide updates on status of the groundwater system and current activities and all things groundwater going on in the Yuba subbasins. Finally is direct data. So the key data from the groundwater subbasins are uploaded to databases that are maintained by the California Department of Water Resources. And those data are available online at this website, sigma.water.ca.gov. Next slide, please, and I'll pass it off to Charles to talk about groundwater monitoring.
Thanks, Jim. Well done. My name is Charles Jonk, and I'm a supervising hydrologist with the Yuba Water Agency. Been with the agency since 2013, and I've been primarily responsible for surface and groundwater network monitoring, reporting to support the agency's missions of flood control, water supply, recreation, hydropower generation, and fisheries restoration. So today I'm going to talk to you about the agency's groundwater monitoring program. And the agency and the State Department of Water Resources have had a long partnership of maintaining this network that you see in the map in front of you to monitor groundwater elevations, water quality, land subsidence, and groundwater interactions with surface water. So on the map here, what you're looking at is a map of the north and south Yuba groundwater subbasins. It's bounded by Honeycutt Creek to the north, the foothills to the east, the Feather River to the west, the Bear River to the south, and it's split in the middle by the Yuba River. All those little circles you see in the map are monitoring wells, and the agency monitors 56 wells at 46 locations on a monthly or semi-annual basis. And together with wells monitored by the state, 87 wells in total are monitored. And then additionally, in groundwater substitution transfer years, monitoring by local irrigation districts, another 240 wells are monitored. The monitoring network provides a strong foundation for understanding the subbasins and allows for effective and proactive management of our water resources. Monitoring helps us keep track of our ability to meet beneficial uses of groundwater, such as for domestic consumption, agricultural irrigation, and other commercial purposes. It also helps us demonstrate progress towards our groundwater sustainability plan goals, as Jim talked about, avoiding undesirable results, basically to achieve a healthy and clean groundwater supply. Monitoring also helps us plan for future activities, such as residential, commercial, and agricultural developments, and monitor changes in short and long-term conditions, such as changing groundwater levels and water quality. Next slide. So there are three main wells that we monitor. Starting with the picture on the left is a picture of a dedicated monitoring well. This well is dedicated solely to monitoring the basin. You see there's 4 PVC pipes sticking out of the well casing, and each of those 4 PVC pipes monitor wells at different elevations, which gives us understanding of the vertical distribution of water in the basin. The picture in the middle of the slide is an agricultural well used to pump groundwater to irrigate local crops such as rice, walnuts, and peaches. And finally, the third type of well is a home domestic well. Next slide. Here we have a depiction of a typical well. The graphic displays the layers of sand, silt, and clay below the ground surface, and the saturated zone in blue at the bottom where groundwater is found. The well casing is mostly solid from the surface all the way down into the saturated zone, where at the bottom it's actually screened. Next depiction. Groundwater enters the well through this screen here and will fill up the casing until the water level is equal with the surrounding saturated zone. When the groundwater level is static or there's no pumping, we can get a snapshot of what the water level is doing in each particular well location. And then together with all the monitoring well data combined, you get a really good picture of what the groundwater levels are doing for the entire basin. Next slide. Well, now that you understand how and where we monitor, let's dive into some of the data. We capture a lot of data from our network. One way of analyzing the data is to create a hydrograph, as shown on the screen. A hydrograph is just simply a graph of water level over time. On the y-axis, or the left side of the graph, is a scale representing the height of the groundwater above and below sea level. In this case, from -30 to 70 feet. 0 represents the elevation of sea level, and the positive numbers are above sea level, and the negative numbers are below. The x-axis, or the bottom of the slide, represents time. In this case, years from 1975 to 2021. So we analyze hydrographs for short and long-term trends. As you can see, the emphasis of the dark line on the graph that just appeared, in the short term, these are in the years of 2011, 2012, we see dips in the groundwater level from summer groundwater production, used for irrigating crops, and then we see rises in the winter from recharge. In the long term, we see benefits of surface water deliveries. And then we have impacts of dry and wet years. And finally, responses to water transfer, pumping, and recovery. As you can see, the groundwater hydrograph, it tells a story of what's happening under the ground over short and long-term periods, which really guides us in groundwater management decision making. Okay. Well, now that you're all experts in analyzing hydrographs, we'll focus on groundwater in the North Yuba subbasin. I think if we were in a class, I'd ask you what's happening here, but since we can all chime in, I'll go ahead and explain a little bit. Well, so this is a graph of groundwater in the North Yuba subbasin. As you recall, Jim spoke to this a little bit earlier, but also as I described, the North subbasin is north of the Yuba River, highlighted by the red box on the map on the right. And so here again, we have a scale of groundwater elevation on the y-axis, the left side of the graph, and time on the x-axis on the bottom. The North Yuba subbasin has a long history of stable groundwater elevations. As you can see, the blue line there is mostly flat from 1945 until most recently. And this is mainly due to the availability of and diversion of surface water by local irrigation districts from the Yuba River since the late 1800s. There is a slight increase since the 1970s due to additional water for those irrigation districts. All right, next slide. This hydrograph is from a well in the South Yuba subbasin. And as you recall, the South Yuba subbasin is south of the Yuba River, highlighted by the red square on the map. And similar to our other graphs, we're using groundwater elevation as a scale on the left side, and we have time on the bottom from 1945 to 2020. And Jim spoke a little bit about the success of the South Basin, and you really see the story here with the shape of the red line. Starting in the late 1940s, there's an increase in farming and irrigation using groundwater, hence a decline in groundwater elevation that continued all the way to the early 1980s. In the 1980s, agreements were formed and a distribution system was built, enabling Yuba Water to deliver surface water from New Lords Bar Reservoir to the local irrigation districts. These surface water deliveries offset the use of groundwater pumping, which has allowed the South Yuba subbasin to recover to its former elevations from the 1940s. So again, this really illustrates a story of success between wise management of water resources and collaboration between Yuba Water Agency and the local irrigation districts. Well, that's all I have for now, and Joanna will give you a few key takeaways.
Thanks, Charles. Yeah, so just to sort of wrap this up, that was an awful lot of information, but the key takeaways from our presentations today are that, groundwater is a primary water source for Yuba County residents, farms, and cities. Groundwater is recharged or refilled in our basins largely from changes in irrigation use as well as natural processes after rain and snow. So it's being used and going down as in the animation, and then it's refilling every year when the rains and snow return. Yuba Water has been monitoring and sustainably managing groundwater for decades, and this work really expanded with the passage of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and now the development of our Groundwater Sustainability Plan. So we have a long history of sustainable groundwater management in Yuba County, and this is primarily because of our ability to switch between surface water uses and groundwater pumping, which is based on water year, water needs, and the previous amounts of rain and snow. So those are the key takeaways. I think Bonnie has a slide on how you can find out more and stay engaged with groundwater in Yuba County.
Great, thank you so much, Joanna. So yes, if you have additional questions or you'd like more information, you can visit our website, yubawater.org. You can also find us on social media at Yuba Water. You can also, if you're interested in subscribing to meeting updates, groundwater@yubawater.org is the email that you want to contact. And let me go ahead and see if there's any questions. Thank you all so much for speaking today. It's wonderful hearing everything come together from the monitoring and the history and some of the more technical and field work that we do. So appreciate it. Okay. Okay. So I did have a question. Someone was wondering if there's any metering that takes place on wells. So are there like controlled meters that you all check?
I can address that. We have metering in recorders, or for several of the wells we have pressure transducers with data loggers that do monitor groundwater level every hour, and we have about 22 wells that contain those in our network.
And Charles, if somebody wanted to see that data, where would they go to access it?
Well, a good place to start is our annual reports. The Groundwater Sustainability Plan is a good location, and then really to dive into the data, you can go to DWR has a website, the Sigma website, that houses all of the data for the whole state for not only our wells but wells for other agencies.
Yeah, Bonnie, if I could just add to that a little bit. So that relates to the groundwater levels that we have here at the subbasins. And if the questioner was curious about metering of groundwater volumes and the pumped volume, we do have some wells that are metered and some wells that aren't. So generally speaking, the wells that are producing water for the municipal water suppliers, so that's like for the city of Wheatland, for Olivehurst PUD, for Linda County Water District, Cal Water, and in Marysville. Those are typically metered. When you look at agricultural wells, if you look for private domestic wells, those are typically not metered, so we don't have direct data on the water use there. We do get some metered data associated with some of the agricultural wells that are involved in some groundwater substitution transfer sales, so those are metered, but the bulk of the other production is not. And so when we look at the groundwater inflows and groundwater outflows, we talked about that being important. We have a variety of tools that we use to try and work with the data that we have and the data that we don't have. And one of those is a sophisticated groundwater model that runs on a groundwater modeling computing platform. And so that takes in the data that we have from those metered wells and also creates estimates of the pumped volume for domestic users and for agricultural users. So we can still try to account for that and try and manage for those uses, even though we don't have direct metered measurements of them.
Okay. We have another question. Someone's asking how they can provide assistance and support to the Yuba Water Agency. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but I suspect maybe citizen science opportunities. Do we offer any citizen?
I can take that one. So first of all, the long-term sustainability of groundwater management in Yuba County does rely a lot on continued coordination and communication across the subbasins. So we really encourage people to attend the Groundwater Sustainability Committee meetings, and if there are questions or issues that come up or project ideas, that's a great forum for discussing those. But the agency, does have a lot of responsibility around communicating, coordinating, collecting all this data. So the purpose of this is really how can we help really get that information out there. So the offer of help would be to participate in our public process and come to meetings. That would be welcome.
Great, and the best way for them to get more information on that, Joanna, is to contact that email address, correct?
Groundwater@yubawater.org, that's right.
Okay. Okay, great. Let me see if there's others.
Also, just to add to that too, if you're interested in helping provide a well, if you're a homeowner that has a well that we could monitor, we're always looking for additional locations too.
Yep, wells or sites for new wells for some of the dedicated monitoring wells that Charles was showing examples of. We're always trying to find locations, and it has to be the right place, but if you have the right place, it'd be a good match.
Okay, so I'm just gonna pop back into the questions. Looks like somebody raised their hand. If you wanted to drop the questions in the Q&A box. Sam, it looked like you had your hand raised. Cam, were you able to type your question into the Q&A box? Maybe it was a mistake hand raise. If there aren't any other questions, we'll go ahead and wrap up. One last chance. Oh, sorry, okay. Some GSMAs are now requiring private well owners to register, Kim Biggs commented. She's asking if that's in the future.
Yeah, that is not currently something that we're thinking about at this point. We don't have the kind of stress conditions that some of these other subbasins are having to deal with, where they are actually trying to clamp down on the volumes being pumped and really looking for people to register and meter their wells. So we're not at that point now, and we don't anticipate getting to that point. We're looking to manage the basin sustainably without having to go through that process.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. I think Jim just made a really good point that, just to clarify, there are many basins in the state that are having to kind of claw back groundwater because they're out of sustainability. And so they have a trajectory of trying to get to sustainability. Where in Yuba Water, in the Yuba subbasins, we have been for a while now in sustainability. So we're trying to maintain. So we're in a really good position to just kind of keep doing what we're doing rather than try to claw back water as other subbasins are having to do.
Good point. Great. I don't see any other questions right now. Thank you all again, Jim, Joanna, Charles, for your time today. And thank you so much to everybody who participated and for bringing your questions. We will have a recording available of today's webinar, and we'll go ahead and contact the attendees who came today and let you know when that recording is available. But in the meantime, happy National Groundwater Awareness Week. Thank you for your interest in Yuba Water Agency and what we do. And Jim, Joanna, Charles, and